Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream, episode 18. My name is CB Robertson, and today is the big day. Today's the day we finally address the thing I have been wanting to address since day one. Yes, today is Transhumanism Day. I'm going to try to not make this too long, but we'll sort of see how things go. For those of you who weren't tracking along at the very beginning, I had been planning on juxtaposing transhumanism with anarcho-primitivism, the subject about which I had an excellent talk with Ben Brower about, as these two philosophical movements that many people, myself included, believe are going to become more dominant and prevalent in the future of politics and broader cultural debates. We had a long talk about anarcho-primitivism, its origins in the sort of punk rock scene, and the philosophers that emerged to support that, including not just Ted Kaczynski, the perhaps most famous one, who denies being an anarcho-primitivist, but captures many of the philosophical underpinnings, but also people as well known as Heidegger and perhaps most beloved of the three, J.R.R. Tolkien. So that's the anarcho-primitivist side. But what about transhumanism? What is transhumanism? Well, we're going to get into that today. So to start with, obviously the best thing to do is to begin with a definition. And what I wanted to knock off the bat is what transhumanism is not. A lot of these movements in the world, you can't take their name at face value. Sometimes they'll give a very, especially in the political world, a very sort of benevolent, save the children kind of name that masks something that is completely different, both in its origins and intentions. So like the Patriot Act, because obviously only non-patriots would oppose that. That kind of language silliness is very common in politics. In philosophy, however, often you get a little bit more honest names. Feminism would be one example. Anyone who studies feminist literature, you would be hard-pressed to say, well, it's really about equality. It's not called gender egalitarianism, it's called feminism. And there's significance to the name in that case. Transhumanism is like that. Transhumanism, you can understand a lot about what transhumanism is from the name directly. So what transhumanism is not is just a love and embrace of technology. There are all kinds of people who love and embrace technology. Some people, anarcho-primitivists and other Luddites among them, Amish and so forth, maybe not so fond of technology. But many people are, and many people say it's in human nature to love technology, to develop technology, to become skilled in the use and design of technology. That's not what transhumanism is about. For transhumanists, technology is a necessary means, but is not the subject of the aim. Or the object, rather, I should say. The object is, as the name implies, the human. Technology is the means for transcending humanity. Transhumanism is the philosophy that seeks to become post-human and is, I would argue, for this reason, anti-human. And I'm not just making this up. I want to read a somewhat extended passage from one of the three semi-famous transhumanists I want to talk about from his website explaining what is transhumanism. This is from nickbostrom.com, talking about transhumanist ethics. Quote, "Transhumanism is a loosely defined movement that has developed gradually over the past 2 decades. Okay, so it's recent. It promotes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities for enhancing the human condition and the human organism opened up by the advancement of technology. So there we have it. Technology is the means, but the aim here is enhancing the human condition and human organism. Attention is given to both present technologies like genetic engineering and information technology and anticipated future ones, such as molecular nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. So they're opening it up for the possibilities of becoming post-human here, because they recognize that's not on the table now, but they're saying with these future technologies that we can anticipate, the desirable thing is to become post-human. The enhancement options being discussed include radical extensions of human health span, eradication of disease, elimination of unnecessary suffering, and augmentation of human intellectual, physical, and emotional capacities. Other transhumanist themes include space colonization and the possibility of creating super intelligent machines, along with other potential developments that could profoundly alter the human condition. Now, it's important to point out here that he's not saying that could profoundly alter the human condition as some kind of this could be a side effect. That's the intention. They're doing this in order to modify the human condition, not for the sake of just more technology. The ambit is not limited to gadgets and medicine, but encompasses also economic, social, institutional designs, cultural development, and psychological skills and techniques. That's creepy. Anyways. Transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. I wonder if those desirable ways are shaped by human nature. As is. Current humanity need not be the endpoint of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have. There is, in my opinion, the definition. I'll read that one more time. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human. That's the goal. That's the aim. That's the entire philosophy, is to become post-human, to transcend our human nature. What does that mean? What is a post-human? We'll get to that in a little bit. Some transhumanists take active steps to increase the probability that they personally will survive long enough to become post-human. For example, by choosing a healthy lifestyle. Yeah, that's not what this is about. Or by making provisions for having themselves cryonically suspended in case of de-animation. In contrast to many other ethical outlooks, which in practice often reflect a reactionary attitude to new technologies, wonder why? The transhumanist view is guided by an evolving vision to take a more proactive approach to technology policy. This vision, in broad strokes, is to create the opportunity to live much longer and healthier lives, to enhance our memory and other intellectual faculties, to refine our emotional experiences and increase our subjective sense of well-being. We'll get to how that's defined later. And generally to achieve a greater degree of control over our lives. This affirmation of human potential is offered as an alternative to customary injunctions against playing God, messing with nature, tampering with our human essence, or displaying punishable hubris. That's a big theme there, which we'll get to when we talk about the origins. I hope I'm not signposting too much. There's a lot going on in this movement, and I want to finish this quote, but yeah. Anyways, carrying on. Transhumanism does not entail technological optimism. No, he is correct. It does not. While future technological capabilities carry immense potential for beneficial deployments, they also could be misused to cause enormous harm. This is, in fact, one of the big arguments they use for transhumanism, but we'll get to that also. Sorry for signposting so much. Anyways, ranging all the way to the extreme possibility of intelligent life becoming extinct. Other potential negative outcomes include widening social inequalities, or a gradual erosion of the hard-to-quantify assets that we care deeply about but tend to neglect in our daily struggle for material gain, such as meaningful human relationships and ecological diversity. Along with, I would add, the other things that were dismissed in the previous paragraph, but more on that later as well. Such risks must be taken very seriously, as thoughtful transhumanists fully acknowledge. True. Transhumanism has roots in secular humanist thinking, yet is more radical in that it promotes not only traditional means of improving human nature, such as education and cultural refinement, but also direct application of medicine and technology to overcome some of our basic biological limits. End quote. So that's Nick Bostrom talking about what is transhumanism, and it's I would say a pretty good summary. If you're not at least slightly creeped out by that, then we might not be on the same aesthetic page. It's very easy to see why a lot of people, when reading or hearing this, would see a lot of good in this. Is like, oh yeah, like increasing human potential, being smarter, living longer, space exploration. That all sounds really cool. But when it also delves into themes that can't really be understood except in religious terms. And we're going to get into that a little bit. So, and in order to do that, I think it's best to go over, at least briefly, the origins of transhumanist thinking. And I was going to do this in chronological order, but I think it would actually be better to go in reverse chronological order. And I'm going to do this by talking about three big transhumanist thinkers, which are Friedrich Nietzsche, Ray Kurzweil, and Nick Bostrom. There are a lot more. There are actually a fair number of transhumanist thinkers. One I thought about bringing up here was David Pearce, the British transhumanist, but I don't think I'll have time to go over that. And Aubrey de Grey, and a number of other people, including one whose name is legally changed to some number, like DC 2040 or something like that. That brings to mind the Ham Saris quote with Jordan Peterson: "My name is a 13-digit number, and if you get one wrong, I'll be offended." It's anyways, yeah, there are a lot of thinkers, but I think as a crash course in what is this all about, the way to approach it is Nietzsche, Ray Kurzweil, and Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom is the Swedish philosopher we just read, who is most famous for creating the simulation hypothesis. Many people often sort of not quite mislabel, but talk about the simulation theory. Elon Musk and Scott Adams are sort of famous proponents of this idea. The theory is actually a little bit less edgy, less matrixy, and more like, here are three possibilities. Maybe worth talking about another time. But what's important as it pertains to transhumanism is not the simulation theory, although that might be related, but it's another essay he wrote, which I'm not going to read in full, because it is, it's a short essay, but it's still fairly long. But I encourage you to read it or listen to it on YouTube. CGP Grey does an excellent dramatic reading, complete with illustrations, that you can check out on YouTube. I'll include a link in the description here. The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant is a defense of the pursuit of immortality, and it's a fun read because you don't often hear philosophers. Oftentimes, academic philosophy is very dry, very sort of Aristotelian. You get these massive tomes that basically make out two sentences with all of this seemingly unnecessary logic phrasing thrown in for boot. But Nick Bostrom is much more like Plato here, at least in that he's giving a narrative structure to it. And he depicts the story of a dragon that comes into a town. And it's this horrible fire-breathing monster, and it demands a tribute of thousands of human souls a day to be sent on a cart to its mountain where he devours them. And the humans try to fight this monster, but they can't. They can't beat it, and they're all killed. And so finally, they just sort of accept the dragon as this invincible adversary that they just have to learn to live with. And so they do. And, things move on. The human race expands. They're still losing all these people daily to the dragon, but, life as a broader thing goes on. And humans develop fairly advanced society. And some scientists begin to develop technology they think might be able to kill the dragon. And out of the woodwork, who should appear but all of these philosophers and religious leaders who say, it's in fact immoral to kill the dragon. It would be bad. It would make us less human to kill the dragon. Our proper end is to be devoured, just as its nature is to devour us. And, of course, in his telling of the story, eventually those people are overruled, and the king orders the commissioning of this rocket that is able to penetrate the dragon's scales and kills it. And everyone celebrates, and they say, yes, now we have time. Now we have time to solve all the problems and do all the good things. And so the whole story is this elaborate and, in my opinion, a very well written little short story that basically depicts all religious and philosophical interpretations of death as a kind of Stockholm syndrome, as a kind of, we've learned to live with it, so we come up with all of these excuses, all of these ex post facto rationales for and rationalizations for why we have to die, so that even when we begin to discover keys for living longer, because the dragon is of course just a metaphor for death itself, they're resistant to it. They're like, no, we want to die. So that's Nick Bostrom. He is still very active in the transhumanist community, talking about existential risk in particular. The second thinker is Ray Kurzweil. And Ray Kurzweil is an interesting guy. He is, but pertinent to this conversation, he's most famous for predicting the technological singularity. And the singularity, for those of you who aren't aware, means the moment that machine intelligence surpasses human intelligence. And this is this great subject of fear and concern and also excitement. Like, will it become Skynet? Or will it be the moment that humans are able to, colonize Mars? Or, as someone like Scott Adams points out, will that be the moment that computers can maintain nuclear reactors with a degree of safety we haven't seen before? Or is that just regular AI? Who knows? That might be a question for a computer scientist. But the idea that at some moment computers will become more intelligent than humans is the idea, and is Ray Kurzweil's big contribution. And I would say the origins of this line of thinking go back to the Enlightenment, really, and the age of reason, and the idea that reason is essentially the most important part of human intelligence. In fact, is human intelligence to a degree. But this conversation wouldn't be complete without going to an anti-Enlightenment philosopher who arguably kicked this whole thing off. And that is Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philologist turned philosopher, a man I rank very highly among the thinkers who has most influenced me who I generally like very much, but I can't thank him for this one. Nietzsche argued very famously that about for the death of God, and he wasn't, of course, as everyone now is familiar, thanks to Jordan Peterson, he didn't necessarily mean that as a triumphant "we killed him, yay!" but as just an observation of fact. It's like, yeah, we killed God, we killed, and speaking specifically of the Christian God, and he said that, how can we be worthy of this? How can we live without a God who created and rules over and gives meaning to our lives? And he says, well, we'll have to become our own gods. We'll have to overcome man. We'll have to overcome ourselves. And this is where the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman, comes from. And the Superman is, in its sort of primordial form, the seed from which the tree of transhumanism grew. I'm not arguing here that Nietzsche would be a supporter of transhumanism. I think he would probably hate it as an anti-life movement, which it is in many ways. And he would hate the transhumanists for the same reason that he absolutely loathed Socrates as anathema, as this inhuman, strange life that has to be shunned and exiled. So between Friedrich Nietzsche, Ray Kurzweil, and Nick Bostrom, you have a basic framework for how transhumanism evolved, where it came from, what it's about, and what it's doing. And it's about a lot of things. It's about human augmentation with intelligence and lifespan and star travel and all these other interesting things. But fundamentally, what it's about is breaking the limitations that define humanity, especially and perhaps primarily those of death. It's about, first and foremost, it is about becoming immortal and all the other things later that the time of immortality would permit humanity to pursue. So I think from there I want to do the pro side, right? Because there is a reason so many people are into this. The people I've described here are sort of the primary sources of transhumanism. Many people have heard about transhumanism through its secondary sources. So like Yuval Noah Harari or Bill Gates or the other people who pick up what Ray Kurzweil and Nick Bostrom are laying down, but they're not really the primary sources. So the arguments for transhumanism can basically be broken down into two kinds. And I'll just try to give a summary of each of the arguments for transhumanism here. The first argument is that transhumanism is good. All right, humans evolved in this limited context. We survived pretty well, but not very long in the grand scheme of things. Dinosaurs were around a lot longer than we were, and they're all extinct now. The odds of us living longer than the dinosaurs, we have a very, very, very long way to go to just match that. But are vanishingly small. 99.98 or whatever percentage of all species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. And that's probably because we haven't discovered a fair number of the ones that were already extinct. So it's probably a lot closer to 99.99999. And we're going to be on that list. Mathematically, almost certainly. So future challenges approach humanity that threaten extinction. So asteroids, plague, dealing with each other is probably the most dangerous, though. And not just nuclear war, but any kind of human-on-human eradication. Human nature itself seems primed to wipe us out. So, to survive, we need to overcome our own limitations. We need to overcome our own nature, not just to deal with the existential threats from without, the asteroids, the plagues, the tsunamis, and so forth, but to survive ourselves, because we are the threat. Humans are, and this is not just at a species level, but also at a personal level. We are to some degree built to die. We're programmed with a 70 to 120 year lifespan, and the imperative for survival requires us to overcome that at a personal level. But even if we didn't care about ourselves for whatever reason, the broader species faces these bigger challenges. And a big part of that, of course, is humans are irrational. We are tribal. We are prone to all kinds of bigotries and outgroup hatred and scapegoating, and that break our rationality. And so technology and systems can improve our ability to think and reason, to become more intelligent. Hyper-intelligent computers can think for us in a way that will save us from ourselves. So, from a pro-life position, transhumanism appears to be good at a level of existential risk. And of course, as Nick Bostrom pointed out, it will also be important because technology and the inevitable march of technology also poses an existential risk. So we have to be extremely careful on that front, which sort of dovetails into our second argument for transhumanism, which is not that transhumanism is good, but that transhumanism is inevitable. Technology cannot be uninvented, and so you may as well embrace it. You may as well be on the winning side, because the power of technology is so great that those who don't embrace it will be left behind, and not just become irrelevant to the story of history, which might be desirable to some people. I would argue it actually is desirable, but to become like completely powerless in the face of people who do embrace the technology. So you're going to want to learn this technology because its advance is inescapable, so that you at least have some say in where these things are going and can move the progress of technology into a good direction, one that improves human lives, rather than just leave it to the evil forces of capitalism that will just mine your corpses for compost in California, or mine your attention to sell you better tchotchkes that appeal to your latest vanity aesthetic that was programmed into you by that same social media technology. So the arguments for it are that transhumanism is good and transhumanism is inevitable anyways. Pretty compelling, right? But now it's time to look at the opposite side and the arguments against transhumanism, which I hope will be more compelling to readers here, but I'll leave it up to you. First of all, before we get into the direct arguments against utilitarianism, I want to take a step back and point out that all of transhumanism is built upon utilitarianism. Not just its values, but its very concepts of reason and intelligence, and also goes without saying, goodness and badness. They're all based upon utilitarianism and the utilitarian frame of thinking. It's a quantitative over a qualitative approach. Now, looking back over some of the things that Nick Bostrom said, and David Pierce and Ray Kurzweil pay homage to some of these points as well, at least lip service. Say, yes, these qualitative things matter, but the reason and the rationality underlying the whole frame fundamentally reject the subjective experiences that are a part of human experience as a part of the human we're seeking to overcome. The tribalism, the instincts. We're not trying to, over here, we're not talking about rejecting the subjective experiences of pleasure and pain, or we want to get rid of pain. David Pearce's first book, it's worth pointing out, is called The Hedonist Imperative. So here we have a very solid foundation of not just utilitarianism, but in fact, we'll just say hedonism right off the bat as a foundation for one of the most prominent transhumanists today. But Bostrom is, of course, also a utilitarian. And this is also one of the reasons why Nietzsche, I think, would cringe seeing transhumanism built upon his Superman, because Nietzsche also hated utilitarianism. And Ray Kurzweil is probably the best example of someone who pays lip service to this idea. He even talks about computers having spiritual experiences. But it's a very shallow, like, even with that kind of language, it's a very shallow view of both, subjective experience and reason and intelligence, because it's built on this utilitarian frame. It's built on this utilitarian frame, and it rejects non-utilitarian thinking as basically irrational. This is also for those of you who aren't aware, I don't think, maybe I won't do a podcast on this, but the third leg of this stool between utilitarianism and transhumanism is behavioral economics. And if you read, for example, Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, his whole premise is that, human beings are so stupid, so irrational. Look at how bad they are at decision making. Look at how bad they are at personal economics and choosing the best outcome for themselves. And of course, his whole premise is that humans should be these utilitarian bean counters, and anything that doesn't maximize utility is stupid by definition. So it's actually very circular, but you have to know what you're looking for to see it. It's really silly, but what it justifies at the level of government is quite broad and terrifying in scope. Anyways, back to transhumanism. So all of transhumanism is built upon utilitarianism, and when we talk about going back up to what Nick Bostrom was saying about enhancing the human condition, enhancing human life, expanding the time that he talks about in the Fable of the Dragon Tyrant, that's quantity. Expanding the possibilities of human experience, that's maximizing utility, or as David Pearce would say, reducing negative utility. So it's at its root, transhumanism is built on utilitarianism, and it retains all of the negative aspects of utilitarianism that I talked about in my podcast on this subject. Utilitarianism is autistic in that it cannot deal with that subjective messiness of human interaction. It just rejects that as irrational and in fact dangerous. And our existence and our survival it necessitates overcoming that irrationality. And that's where technology comes to the rescue. That's where transhumanism comes to the rescue to save us from ourselves. So the framework of transhumanism is autistic from its foundation, and it carries all of the negative traits of utilitarianism, including its tyrannical and antinatal tendencies, which I talked about in my podcast on the subject. And this takes on a very creepy tone when you hear Nick Bostrom talk about existential risk. At one point, and I can't remember if it was in his TED Talk or in one of his essays on his website, I should have looked it up before I did this, but at one point he describes the life he wants to preserve as something like, and I think I'm quoting this verbatim, but I'll have to double check at some point. Earth originating sentient life. That's a very weird way to talk about us. But what it does is it separates the life that he cares about from the rest of humanity. And remember, humans are a big part of this risk. So humans become a risk to the Earth originating sentient life, at least in potential. For Nick Bostrom, existential risk, and this is a very powerful term. Keep an eye out for this term, existential risk. I imagine we're going to be hearing a lot more of that term in the coming decades. It's picking up, especially among the Yuval Noah Harari and Bill Gates types, let alone the World Economic Forum and their whole thing. It describes anything that not just threatens extinction, but threatens permanently threatens potentials for human growth as well. And in his TED Talk on existential risk, Nick Bostrom broke down in mathematical terms, the length of infinity that an existential risk would mitigate. And he was quoting another philosopher whose name I forget, but basically, maybe Carl Sagan, I don't remember exactly. But basically, there is almost nothing that would not be justified in terms of harming people now. Like we're talking millions of people dying, potentially, in order to protect the species as a whole from projected threats in the future. Pause on that line of thought for a second, and I will link to Nick Bostrom's TED Talk here, because you have to hear it from his own mouth. When people become so confident in their models of what is going to happen, and I hope anyone who's been following the climate science for the last few years will at least pause on that before murdering millions of human beings to preserve us from some imagined or projected risk. The potential power that is being justified at the hands of the state by this statement. I spoke in my podcast about Curtis Yarvin, about how the Machiavellians, there's this pattern of political speech throughout history of there's a latent position, and then there's the patent position. The example James Burnham gave in his book on the Machiavellians was of De Monarchia by Dante, and how the arguments offered for his idea of the ideal state are like ridiculous and weak, but it wasn't about that. It was about justifying some one side over another in some petty political division in Venice. And every inaugural speech, whether it's Biden's recent red speech or even one of Trump's speeches, it has a patent verbiage, which is usually nonsensical, but then there's a latent meaning that of what it justifies. This language of existential risk is the most justifying kind of concept for political power imaginable, basically. It would give an imperative to states to take charge to save humanity itself from human beings who risk the potential possibilities of Earth originating sentient life. So if the tyrannical tendencies of utilitarianism were bad because everybody is a part of that equation, transhumanism is that on steroids and human growth hormone and stilts. So it's terrifying from a political perspective, and it's hard to know when you see someone like Nick Bostrom give this speech, because when you watch Nick Bostrom speak, he comes across as a sincere academic. He comes across as someone who is genuinely interested in the ideas and playing these thoughts out in conceptual form. He doesn't come across as someone who's a political player. That said, I don't know. I couldn't say for sure. I wouldn't bet on it. But regardless of what his intentions are, the effects of this kind of argument are very obvious. And, throughout history, existential risk has been used to justify that kind of power, though oftentimes they had to find that existential risk in the supernatural, in the fate of the souls of the citizenry, or something to that effect. Now we have physical explanations, or at least in potentia physical explanations, the possibility of existential risk. So that's a big concern, obviously. But what about the immortality thing? What about the possibilities of development and improving human life? Isn't that a good thing, even if we could get rid of the politics of what transhumanism and the future of humanity seems to justify when it's paired with this concept of existential risk? What about immortality? As a counter to Nick Bostrom's Fable of the Dragon Tyrant, I would like to summon the myth of the Lich. The Lich is a very interesting mythological creature. I think it was first given the name Lich in some piece of German poetry whose name I forget. It's tied to death, Licht. But the first example of, and this was kind of codified by Dungeons and Dragons of all things, but the character of the Lich predates the name. We see it very prominently in pop culture with Sauron from Lord of the Rings, very much a Lich character, and also with Voldemort in Harry Potter. The first example, to my knowledge, is Koschei the Immortal. This is a Russian folk tale of a man who achieved immortality by hiding his soul within the eye of a needle, within an egg, within a bird, within a rabbit, buried in a chest under an oak tree. And it took a young hero and he was this like decrepit old man who predated on young women and was this the archetype of the evil king. And it took a young heroic warrior named Ilya. I always liked the subtle linguistic crossover with the Iliad, but Ilya to go and fight him and kill him. Killing him meaning digging up the chest, freeing the rabbit, killing the bird, breaking the egg, and then finally breaking the needle. The Lich is an interesting character because although they are immortal, their imagery and the iconography is all deathly. They are often dead themselves or death-like, and this is not just Sauron and Voldemort, but also Koschei. And, of course, all the D&D depictions, they have like a skull on the top. This is not just, I don't think this artistic depiction is just a matter of storytelling. The danger of the Lich, because I had imagined writing a short story back when I was in college, taking a very Ayn Randian objectivist position that the Lich is hated in all of these pieces of literature because people are jealous of what the Lich has, and so they demonize the immortal by depicting him in all his deathliness, when in reality he's just someone who has done something good and the people hate him for it. That was what I had sort of planned on writing. And the more I explored the subject, the more I realized there was actually a much deeper antipathy to the Lich than that kind of superficial objectivist jealousy or resentment. It has to do, and the deathly imagery of the Lich is an imagery of stasis. It's an imagery of things being the same. Karl Popper funnily accused Plato of imagining this horrible, tyrannical, totalitarian state in the Republic, which he kind of did. He didn't advocate for it, but he did describe it. And Popper's description of what Plato was describing was a state that did not change. And he thought that Plato thought that was perfection. The changeless state was the perfect state. But of course, everyone who ever read that description of this changeless state, including Plato, who described it, understood that this is horrific. A changeless state is actually awful and is something you want to avoid. No one wants to be stuck in that stasis. And while transhumanism embraces a kind of romantic imagery of motion and progress that's made possible with the time we would have to develop it, what transhumanism is actually pursuing is that kind of stasis. It's pursuing the survival not of humanity, because remember, we're trying to transcend humanity. We're trying to preserve Earth-originating sentient life. We're trying to preserve consciousness. We're trying to preserve intelligence. We're trying to preserve, specifically, autistic intelligence. We're trying to preserve the reasoning processes that are good and that don't suffer. Because humans suffer. That's a big problem. We're trying to preserve Earth-originating sentient life. And essentially computers, which are the distillation and image of autistic intelligence. The computer algorithm is the autist's idea of what intelligence is, because it can do processes faster than humans can. Isn't that the definition of intelligence? Isn't that the G-score of IQ? That's all it is. That's all it is, right? And I mean, you see this come out, and I'm not positing that J.K. Rowling intended this. She clearly intended a sort of ethno-nationalist kind of leaning here. But when the Death Eaters and Voldemort talk about purebloods as opposed to mudbloods with such disdain, it reflects the love of the purity of the mathematical and digital realm, the pure reason made possible by technology and computers, and the disdain for the messy, organic irrationality of human life. Transhumanism and the ideal of transhumanism expresses a hatred of humanity. And I say that as the author of In Defense of Hatred, as someone who has studied hatred, and who knows what it looks like to a degree. So the myth of the Lich is what captures transhumanism. It's the pursuit of immortality, but what is being immortalized is not real life. It's this zombie-like thing, perhaps an intelligent zombie, but a zombie nonetheless, not fully human, only a facsimile of humanity, an autistic digital projection of what a human being might look like if you just took their posts and uploaded them to the cloud. That's not a human being. Thankfully, because of their autistic understanding of what intelligence is and of how technology progresses, there is no reason to believe that that the singularity, or what they're talking about, is in the cards in the coming future. I wouldn't go so far as Thomas Rousel, aka Survive the Jive, in one of his recent speeches, in saying it can never happen. I would like to believe that. I don't share his certainty, but I think he's much closer to correct than Ray Kurzweil is. But wouldn't it be nice to, and I want to close on a positive point, because this whole subject can get very dark. So I want to close with a positive take on death, because wouldn't it be good? Wouldn't it be good if we could live forever? If at least we could live longer? Or, like, perhaps best of all, perhaps we achieve a state like the TV show In the Good Place, where we live as long as we like, and then we get to, when we get bored, to walk out and end it or something. Wouldn't it be good to live forever? I don't think so. And maybe I am just in the Stockholm syndrome of the Fable of the Dragon Tyrant that Nick Bostrom described. But I don't think so. I think after thinking about it, and after thinking about what we are as human beings, which is the thing they're trying to overcome, to transcend and become Übermensch, I think death is a part of who we are. It's a part of the process of change, which is why there is no change in the Lich's kingdom. And the important point to understand here is that we, as individuals, are not the organism. The organism for which survival and reproduction is modifying and improving is the lineage. Our lineage. And here I don't just mean the biological genetic component. That's obviously a very important part. But I'm also talking about our history, and also our culture and our language and our traditions. This story that we tell about ourselves, as well as the biological substrate that makes up the actors in this story, are all a part of this lineage that has lived, for perhaps 100,000 years, perhaps less, perhaps more. Hopefully we have a long way to go as well. But we as individuals are, avatars of that lineage. We come into existence for a moment to carry the burden of being that, and hopefully to do it well. And then once we have had our time, we pass that burden on to the next thing. We are like skin cells in a body, or perhaps less gloriously, fingernails that have to get clipped off from time to time. We are a part of the body, but we're not the body. And when I look back in history, the people who live good lives don't hit the end of their life with terror of death. The stories I hear of people who have lived good lives reach the end of their life with a feeling of release and relaxation. I heard a comedian once describe getting older or approaching death in old age as leaving a B-rated movie. It was a good time, but you wouldn't want to go back and do it again. Maybe a little more highbrow, I'm reminded of in Plato's Republic. The story opens with Socrates visiting the house of Cephalus, an aging man, and at one point Socrates asks him, Cephalus, do you still have sex? Can you still get it up? Or are you like other old men that struggle with that and suffer with impotence that way? And Cephalus says, Socrates, I don't feel those urges much anymore. And without those urges, I feel like a this tyrannical demon has left me, and I feel more free and more relaxed. Like I'm not suffering under this overpowering tyrant that's driving me to do these things anymore. And it's actually quite pleasing, fun as it was in youth. And I think that view can be taken of life as a whole too, to reach the end of our lives in natural old age, and to be pleased with what we've done, but ready to be done. And that if in old age you find yourself, as Cephalus described, very, very concerned about death, and in fact fearing death with great trepidation, that might be a symptom of something else. That might be a symptom that you have wronged people, that you didn't live a good life, and that you are, or that you valued the wrong things while living, that you didn't live well, and that no amount of extending your life and fleeing from death by continuing the exhausting work of life will allow you to escape from yourself. You might need some very powerful drugs for that. Thankfully, transhumanism plans on offering that. I'm not sure how effective that will be. But within the natural view, the view that embraces technology, we're not we're not all Luddites here. We're not like Ted Kaczynski. Oh, technology hurts the human power cycle. It can do that, but as Crawford pointed out, as I tried to describe Crawford pointing out in my last podcast here, there are great potentials for development in skill and power through the use and mastery of technology, but without trying to overcome yourself or anything. We can live good lives and solve problems. There are problems up on the horizon, and we can face them as humans with a connection with our past, without rejecting our past and without rejecting who we are, and without fear of the changes that might come in the future, but with the hope that we will have some connection to that future as well. So that's my argument, my brief summary of the argument for transhumanism, my explanation of what it is, what I hope was a compelling argument against it. But feel free to leave your comments down below and do your own research. It is a fascinating subject in its own right, whether you like it or hate it, as I do. And it's probably going to be more prominent in the coming years. So anyways, thanks so much for listening. Take care.